This week's episode is not going to be a weekly match recap, but instead I want to talk about what the Big Four means to me and why they are the Big Four. Welcome tennis fans to Tennis Traverse Exploring the Game, the podcast that delves into the heart of the tennis world. I'm your host Ivy Zhang. In today's episode, I will be talking about the retirement of Rafa Nadal and the Big Four. So before I begin, I want to talk about why I chose to record this episode at this time. So Rafa announced that he will be retiring from professional tennis last week after playing at the Davis Cup. And it was, to be honest, he did announce before the season that this is going to be his retirement season, and I sort of was prepared, but at the same time I just really didn't know when. And he keeps on saying that he will retire, but just finally making that video and saying that he's not going to play anymore really hits it deep, and it really made me realize that we're not going to see another match between Rafa Nadal and, for example, Novak Djokovic. It's really sad to see players who've had created such just unique legacies retire, and I think I want to spend today's episode talking about my stories with them, and just, of course, I'm not taking away from the records and just performances of other players who maybe haven't done as well as them, but because they're obviously the Big Four, they're a Big Four for a reason, and I feel like they've just been here forever, ever since my basically obsession started with tennis. So yeah, and I'm going to talk about them one by one, starting off with Andy Murray. So I started watching tennis as a really invested fan in 2020, I think, or around 2019, because I started playing tennis at when I was in 5th grade. And I think when I was in 5th grade, I was watching tennis, but I wasn't really, completely invested, because I don't know, I was just young, I guess. But ever since COVID hit, I think it just became such a huge part of my life. And Andy Murray, obviously, he shined around the 2016 time period, so I really didn't see him when he is at his peak. But I think the word that comes to mind associated with Andy is just resilience, because he is able to there's so many points against so many players. I think there's one match that really comes into mind, which is his Australian Open match against Novak Djokovic. That was one of the best matches I've ever watched. I think both players truly gave their everything, and it was just such a great match. And when you think about Andy, he has a fake hip. He's been going out here grinding since he was really young, challenging the other big three players. I think he's worth talking about, and it was really sad to see his retirement at the Olympics this year, but I think he's really having fun with his retired life. I'm really happy that these players really get to enjoy tennis sort of after they're retired, because I think just approaching it with a different angle as more of a watcher rather than a player is really beneficial for them, and they can just enjoy a sport that they once played, and I think that's beautiful. But yeah, I feel like I haven't really watched Andy Murray at his peak, but I really love the way he plays. I think he just represents a classic British player, and I think the one word that comes to mind is just resilience. That one point against Kokkinakis where he chased down every single ball, even when there were smashes, it was just an insane point, and I truly enjoyed it. And now I want to talk about Roger Federer. So I think the word that comes to mind when talking about Roger is legend, or thinking about it, maybe classic, because I think he's just a representation of tennis. Even though he didn't get, for example, as much as many Grand Slams as Novak Djokovic or Rafa did, but he's just iconic. Like when you think of tennis, you think of Roger Federer just because of how he plays, how he has such a good feel on the ball, and it's just beautiful to see his one-handed backhand and his serve. I think it's just classic, especially him on Wimbledon grounds. It's just iconic. Yeah, but I think the most precious memory I have of him, I've actually never watched him play in real life, but I think it's when he played in that Lavers Cup in 2022 with Rafa Nadal, and it was really like interesting because I was also in my tennis season at that time, and I was on the bus to one of our games and I was watching it from my phone, so it was just really interesting to see how both of our lives intersected in tennis. It was a really unique feeling, and I think to watch a player like that play his final match with one of his biggest rivals is just incredible. And Rafa is going to do the same thing at the Lavers Cup. He's going to play doubles with Carlos Alcaraz. I think obviously it's going to be a great match. Amazing match. And even though Rafa isn't the way he is before, I still think just watching Rafa plays is amazing. Going back to Roger, I really think just these players' mentality of never giving up despite having an injury, like Roger's knee injury. It's just these players are growing old, but they still manage to claim their dominance over such a long period of time, even though maybe Roger didn't manage to win a lot of Grand Slams after his knee injury. I still think he just, every time he steps on court, you still sort of like think that he's going to win, even if it's against like a really high ranked opponent. I think that's the type of level they bring to the sport. So yeah, and now I want to talk about Novak Djokovic. I think there's more to say about Novak just because of how he managed to sort of prolong his time in tennis, and just his longevity. So I actually watched Novak for a lot of times. I watched Novak at the China Open, when I was really young. I did watch a match between Novak Djokovic and Rafa Nadal. I think I mentioned this a few episodes ago, but it was Novak won in 2 straight sets, but it was the final of China Open, and it was just, I think, back when I was really young, I didn't realize how precious it was, and it wasn't like they were not going to retire anytime soon back then, and now if you were to watch a match between them, you know that it's like they played their last match today, and to watch them play at the China Open, I think, is one of the best memories I have, even though I feel like I really don't remember much from it. But I think Djokovic is probably the first ever player I watched play in real life, and I think from watching on the television screen to watching in real life, the television screen really don't do a justice of how fast the ball is traveling. Like, I don't think you guys understand, but the ball is going so fast if you've ever watched an in-person tennis match. And yeah, but I think it's just such a precious memory, and his discipline. I read his book, I think, on discipline, and he talked about how every time he win a tournament, he only allows himself to eat a small piece of dark chocolate. I think a lot of these players are perfectionists in that they really demand 100% of self-control that I look up to. And I mean, this year, even though he maybe didn't have his best year, he achieved his main goal, which is to win that Olympic gold, and he did it. And I mean, we really don't know what the future is going to be like because all of his main rivals are retired, and I think it will take something out of him mentally too, because even though there are new players such as Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz, but just to have that long rivalry he had with those guys who are like 20-25 years is just incredible, and it's something that you really can't move past easily. So I'm really interested to see how his next season goes, especially at Australia. I don't know how it's gonna work out, because Australia is a place where he gets a lot of his titles and he plays really well there, but this year he just hasn't done really well. So I mean, I don't know where his motivation is gonna come from, but if you really think about Novak Djokovic, I think he just comes out here and crushes it when he really wants it. And I feel like just a tiny feeling that next year maybe will be his last full year on tour, and after that we really don't know what's gonna happen. And now I want to talk about Rafa Nadal. And when I heard the news that he was going to retire, I sort of didn't know how to react, because I think he's a player that to say this is kind of weird, but I often underestimated him. For example, when he played in that, I think 2021 Australian Open final against Medvedev, I thought Medvedev was gonna win. I feel like even though I know Rafa and I know he has such a resilient and just such passion for the game, I still sometimes feel like, I don't know, it's just me. I know it's just me, but I don't know, I feel like sometimes I often underestimate him, but he always proves me wrong, and I love to be proven wrong by him just because of how he plays. And I watched this interview a little while back from him, and he talked about how he never broken a racket, which is just outstanding sportsmanship. I think for a player to never break a racket when you've been on tour for so long is just, it really shows his respect for tennis. Not only his respect, but also his passion for the sport, and just how much he really treats, like how well he treats himself doing this sport. I don't know if that makes sense, but I really think he's doing really well, and I just love how he represents tennis. And I'm not gonna name drop the other players, but there are some players who after they lose, they just completely destroys a racket, or they do something that's just sort of self-damaging. And if you really look at them, I would often think they're not a good role model for young kids. But if you look at Rafa, he's just always someone that you can look up to no matter what. He's always giving it his best shot. He's never giving up. And to be honest, just his balls are so fast. Like, I don't think, again, the television screen doesn't do it justice, but like when you look right on a television screen when he plays against a random opponent, it looks like both of their, like when they're rallying, their speeds are the same. But no, Rafa's ball speed is incredibly fast and incredibly spinny. I think just his passion for the sport, I know I'm like jumping, but his passion for the sport is so profound. And obviously it's going to be sad that he's retiring, and he's such a huge motivation to everyone, not only Novak, but to, for example, Carlos Alcaraz, to Jannik Sinner. I think they grew up watching Nadal play, and for Nadal to just finally retire and for them to share the last year with him is so precious, and I think we really should savor it. But that's all for today's episode. I know this one is really short. I think this might be the shortest episode we've ever filmed, but I mean, I was really hit hard by the news of Rafa retiring. I don't know if you guys can tell, and my tennis season also ended. It was my last ever tennis season in high school, and both of these are just really sad, and it kind of happened in the same week, which isn't ideal, but I mean, it is what it is, and I'm sure that he's going to create more memories either playing tennis or watching tennis, and I'm going to also create more memories. So yeah, but please follow all of my social medias if you haven't already. That is Instagram and Twitter using @TennisTraverse. That is @TennisTraverse. If you're listening on YouTube, comment, like, and subscribe. If you're listening on other streaming platforms, please rate my show. And next week, I think we'll talk about a lot of more tournaments coming up, just because I think there's the Shanghai Masters, and when like Rafa actually plays his last doubles match at the Laver Cup, I will be talking about it with you guys. So yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Bye.